wanted to begin. I'd like to begin my presentation on how Platypus is a pre-political project by reference to two events. One which took place 4 years ago during our convention, namely the killing of Osama bin Laden by the United States. That took place while I was giving my president's report that year. What's likely to be happening at some point during our meeting today is the announcement of Hillary Clinton's candidacy for president. And so I want to do a in-depth journalistic portrayal of this that happened while you guys were partying last night.
Okay, tomorrow's the big day, Mrs. Clinton. You're finally going to announce that you're running for president.
Oh. Did you send it to the live people? Okay.
My gosh, I don't know if I have it in me. I'm scared. I'm kidding. Let's do this.
Oh, Hillary, you put the hill in hilarious. Now, since we're announcing your candidacy via social media, we thought it would be fun if you actually filmed the video yourself on your own phone. That way it seems more personal and intimate.
Personal and intimate, yes. I better take off this jacket then.
That's much better. Now, want to do some vocal warm-ups and then we'll get started?
Ooh, okay, I'd love to. Hillary's a granny with a twinkle in her eye. Hillary's a granny and she makes an apple pie. First female president, me, 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 me.
Okay, great, Mrs. Clinton. Okay, now hold up your phone and you can just look natural, okay? And maybe you want to soften a little. Okay, a little more. Okay, maybe a lot more. Great. Great, okay, and action.
Citizens, you will elect me. I will be your leader.
Okay, great. Let's stop there.
No, okay.
Ma'am, I think you may be coming off as just a little hard.
Oh, shoot. What part?
Well, sort of all of it, but that's okay. Let's try again. And remember, you said this new campaign is not about you. You know, it's about the people. So let's try one where you don't say I or even your own name.
Okay. Oh, that'll be easy. Got it. Hello, 'tis I, Hillary Clinton.
Let's stop again, okay? You said I and your full name immediately.
Yes. Oh, shoot. I did?
Yeah, but don't worry. We'll just delete that one off your phone.
Okay. Know a thing or two about that, right? Oh, Christina, meet my hand in the air.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Yes. Good.
Okay, let's keep going, and this time maybe focus on all that you've done for women's rights.
Oh, okay, that's good. I am running because I want to be a voice for women everywhere.
Did someone say women everywhere? Hillary would make a great president, and I would make an even greater first dude.
Thank you, Bill. That's nice.
Hillary, isn't it crazy that phones can take videos now? I mean, if they could have done that in the 90s, I'd be in jail.
Great, Bill. I love jokes about that.
Okay, I get it. This election is about you. I don't want to hog your limelight. I am leaving. Look at me go. Bye. I'm gone.
Aren't we such a fun, approachable dynasty?
All right, you know what? Let's refocus on your candidacy.
Okay.
And remember, the new Hillary is humble and gracious.
Yes, got it. I know this election season won't be easy. I'm sure I will face some stiff competition from my fellow Democrats. People like Martin O'Malley, who could really give me a run for my money. I'm sorry I broke It's too funny. Martin O'Malley instead of me. He sounds like a Simpsons character. Okay, let me keep going. At the end of the day, America, you deserve a leader who cares about you. And that is why I would make a great president.
And surprise, I will be her VP. And if anything happens to her, God forbid, I will happily be president of the United States again. It'll be Bill Clinton too, bigger and blacker.
Oh,
All right, okay.
he's joking, America. My vice president, of course, will be me.
Once again, you can't be your own vice president.
We will see about that.
Well, let's just jump to the end of the speech, okay?
In closing, I am so excited for the next chapter in American history. And I promise that with Hillary Clinton in charge, it will be a brand new White House. Oh, who am I kidding? Buckle up, America, because the Clintons are back! And live from New York, it's Saturday night!
So, whereas 4 years ago,
start the next one immediately. Yeah.
no, that's why.
Close the tab.
Hold on, children. Apple go. So whereas 4 years ago we were dealing still with the origins of Platypus during the War on Terror, we now have to think about how we're dealing with the next election cycle. In other words, this convention, looking ahead to academic year 2015 to 2016, the left is going to be much more dominated by the politics of the general election cycle in the United States than we might want to think about right now. And we got a little bit of a preview of that in all the discussion around the mayoral race in Chicago that went on various panels that took place yesterday. This is the kind of jitters that people are getting about the Democrats. And we have suffered, along with the rest of the left, in certain respects, from 2 terms of Obama. Obamaism really did represent the first challenge to Platypus, namely the second phase of Platypus. I wanted to bring up something that came up in the morning members' plenary, namely the death of the left, and what do we mean by that, and is it desirable or not? So Platypus started out with the left is dead, long live the left, when the left was coming back. In other words, we made that statement, that declaration, in the context of the left seeming to come back to life. So there's a difference between the left being dead because it seems to be alive, and the left being dead in a more literal, straightforward sense. So really our concept of the death of the left is predicated on the left being alive. Now, there's a differential left that's referred to in this context. The return of the left in the anti-war movement was the return of the Marxist left, meaning this is to be distinguished from the anti-globalization left, and also, therefore, to be distinguished from the Occupy moment, the Occupy left. Since it came up earlier, the issue of millennial Marxism. Millennial Marxism is a product of 2 things, perhaps 3 things. One is, of course, the economic crisis. But the other is the post-Occupy moment. And since his name was already mentioned, otherwise, I would certainly never utter it, Ben Campbell, the author of the boycott letter, that still is a pain in the ass for us. He was part of a milieu. He wanted to be part of Jacobin magazine, but couldn't get along with Bhaskar Sankara. He was around the North Star, which is a project by Louis Project, a ex-SWP, ex-Trotskyist, American SWP, Trotskyist in New York City, who bankrolled that effort by an ex-ISO member, Pham Binh. this was very much about the post-Occupy moment, meaning how do we build the left in the wake of Occupy? How do we turn what was nebulous and kind of anarchoid and liberal into something more rigorous and Marxist? And Jacobin magazine also comes out of that. We need to acknowledge that. However, this fourth phase has not been like the first phase of Platypus. In other words, it's not a matter of the left being dead, especially when it appears to be alive, and especially when it appears to be alive as Marxist. We should have been more prepared for this than we were, as it turns out, given the fact that there was a renewed interest in Marxism in a different way from the anti-war movement, anti-imperialist Marxism, in the context of the economic crisis. And also in the context of a kind of New Deal, neo-Keynesianism during the second phase. In other words, the expectation that Obama end the economic crisis, the combination of Obama and all Democratic Party dominated Congress, which we should remember the first 2 years of Obama, they had close to a supermajority in the Senate, and they had a majority in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. So really they could have done whatever they wanted to. And so there was an expectation that the combination of a Democratic majority and the economic crisis was an opportunity to repair not only the effects of Reaganism, but also the effects of Clintonism. Right? In other words, the dismantling of the welfare state that actually Clinton did, Reagan didn't do, but that Clinton did. So anyway, this is, you see all the threads that are coming back together with respect to this. And I mentioned last night on the panel when I was accused by Tom Riley of the international Bolshevik tendency of having quit the Spartacus League, or really he said that Richard and I had both quit the Spartacus League because we didn't want to support the Spartacist line on defense of Iraq in the Gulf War. Neither of us had any problem with that line at the time whatsoever. No problem whatsoever.
We both joined at the time of the Gulf War.
We both joined at the time of the Gulf War. In other words, we were, in a sense, politicized around the Gulf War, and were, in that sense, politicized around a traditional anti-imperialist revolutionary defeatism. Very much so. And so, notice that Tom Riley didn't have anything to say when I said, well, really, I quit the Spartacus League because Bill Clinton was elected. In other words, he thought, well, that amounts to the same thing. In other words, to be demoralized and to capitulate to the imperialist bourgeoisie amounts to the same thing, right? It amounts to a disagreement. So all of this to say, the topic of this President's Report this year, which I'm going to do a little bit more impromptu than I've done previously, a little bit more extemporaneously than I usually do, is the pre-political. So there's been some discussion already on the list with respect to this, coming out of the Orcom reports, about, well, a couple of things. How the pre-political is actually a post-political situation, and how we understand that post-political situation. In other words, it's not a post-political situation with respect to the collapse of the anti-war movement and the election of Obama. No, it goes much deeper back than that. In our sort of short statement of purpose that we use in promoting Platypus that we formulated very early on, we list the three phases of the left whose legacy we have to work through in Platypus. Namely, the old left of the 1920s, 1930s, by which we mean the Stalinization of the Third International, the new left of the 60s and 70s, and the post-political left of the 80s and 90s. In other words, we distinguish between the new left and its institutionalization as post-political in the 80s and 90s. And that post-political left is something that was in the background for our project, but is looming larger. So already in the discussion that we had this morning, the members' plenary, we had to distinguish between taking the dying confessions of the left versus draining the swamp. And I piped up from the audience, because I didn't want to miss the opportunity, that in that we were facing a differential historical phenomenon. Namely, we want to take the dying confession of the new left, and we want to drain the swamp of the post-political left. Now, why did Ian come up with that formulation? Because, of course, at the time that we were formulating these things around the platypus synthesis at our first convention in 2009, the ISO loomed very large for us in a way that we should remark how little, in a sense, the ISO looms for us right now, actually. And that's because the ISO was one of the larger organizers of the anti-war movement, in fact. And what's interesting is that they were much more willing to engage us at that time, when we supposedly had the greatest difference with them and would have, in a sense, confronted the activism more directly with respect to our supposed neocon pro-imperialists. None of that stuff came up at that time. It should be noted. So the ISO, I'll remind you guys, so Bhaskar Sankara, who comes up, the Jacobin magazine impresario, the owner, the proprietor, the publisher, he spoke last year at the ISO's annual convention, which takes place in Chicago. They're a Chicago-based organization, about his project. And he said a couple of things. He said that, first of all, that his project is not a pre-political project, but a political project. And he didn't bring up Platypus, although he reads Platypus, because it comes up in a lot of his stuff. But he didn't acknowledge us. Instead, he took aim at, in a sense, a softer target, endnotes. That, unlike endnotes, which is pre-political or non-political or theoretical, Jacobin aims to be political. And what he meant by that was, we want to engage the activists. We don't want to stand off aloof from activism and simply comment or analyze or provide theoretical viewpoints. We want to engage the activists. And he said that to the ISO, congregated membership. And he said also that he wants to link up the new left generation with a new generation of activists in the context of there not being an in-between generation. In other words, that there isn't a generational link-up between people in their 20s and people in their 60s and 70s, to which, of course, the ISO membership, which is predominantly 1980s generation membership, said, what about us? And then there was nervous laughter. Because I think that I posted this to the list. This is in the form of an audio recording that we have this documented. And he didn't respond. Right? He didn't respond. Because it's implicit. In other words, the idea is that, yes, there was activism in the 80s and 90s, but it's really not of any account. In other words, the post-political character of the 80s and 90s, this is not something that we came up with by any means. So it's observed and acknowledged. It's also proclaimed. In other words, the anarchist left of the 90s had a couple of formulations with respect to this. The anti-globalization, the anarchist wing of the anti-globalization moment. One is post-political, and the other is post-left. Right? So these are alternative formulations, but actually mean the same thing. In other words, that it's post-political because post-left, and post-left because it's post-political. In other words, they flow from each other. Whereas, by contrast, the moment of opportunity for Platypus was the possibility not only of a return of Marxism, because we found it to be entirely specious, namely Marxism reduced to the question of anti-imperialism, but also a shift from the post-political to some new form of politics. In other words, a next leftism, if not a new leftism, a next leftism, which is something that's you can find in our What is the Platypus on Surviving the Extinction of the Left, but again is not original to us. That's actually the slogan of the new SDS, which was founded 6 months before we were founded. They had the next left, that was their publication. So the return of leftism, in other words, getting out from under post-leftism, was also a way of repoliticizing after the post-political. In other words, these things go hand in hand. So a couple of misleading aspects of characterizing Platypus as a pre-political project. What we were saying in the anti-war movement moment, and that we must continue to say, is that we are pre-political not in the way that, let's say, the new SDS thought of itself as pre-political. In other words, we're not immediately preparatory for politics. We're one step removed. In other words, we're
No,
not...
Chris, I don't know if the members are actually getting a feed. Someone just asked, are we still waiting?
Maybe I didn't hit record.
Boy, babe.
What? Okay. Sorry about that. You guys missed a lot of it, but it's being audio recorded anyway. What was I saying?
Oh, I don't
We're not, this is one step removed.
One step removed. One step removed. Meaning, we're not pre-political in the sense that we're literally preparing to become political. No. That's because it's not Platypus that is pre-political, but rather our moment that is pre-political. In other words, it's not a choice that we're making to be pre-political. It's rather our recognition of a historical moment that is pre-political. And we recognize it, therefore, as having tasks that are pre-political in the sense of not immediately preparing for politics, but one step removed from even that. So Barbara Dorn, who's a British member of the International Bolshevik Tendency, of whose Tom Riley spoke yesterday at the plenary, she, in encountering Platypus, said that we're a self-orientation project. In other words, we're figuring things out. Now, of course, the way she understood that was, and that was accurate, but the way she understood it is, of course, inaccurate, meaning we're figuring things out before doing something. All right, figuring things out before doing something. Yes and no. Yes and no. And I think that in the morning plenary, the members' plenary, Jamie used a great metaphor, namely that we are throwing the stone further than we might be able to catch up with ourselves. Meaning that when we talk about Platypus becoming obsolete or Platypus no longer needing to be necessary, that even thinking about that is rather premature. And I think that I wrote to the list a few weeks ago about the continued necessity of Platypus, that in certain respects Platypus would remain necessary if the left were ever to become more political, or if there were, to put it another way, an actual renascent left. That in that respect, Platypus has two aspects. One is very much of our moment, and another is something that was always needed, in fact, if, however, in a different way. And I think that early on in Platypus, we pointed to C. Wright Mills hosting an argument between, was it Earl Browder? No, who's the...
No,
It was
my article.
Browder and Shackman.
Browder and Shackman. So a CP, ex-CP, and Max Shackman, ex-Trotskyist in a way. And C. Wright Mills hosting a debate between them. And again...
There goes the course.
That's what Shackman says about Browder. But in fact, they could say it of each other. Really, C. Wright Mills could say it of both of them, actually. So are we doing something like C. Wright Mills was doing in hosting a debate between an ex-CPer and an ex-Trotskyist in the late 40s or the early 50s? Anyway, in the 50s, yeah. So it's kind of deep in a post-old left moment and quite distant from a pre-new left moment, in fact. And so that was an example that we found early on that indicated to us that something like this has always been necessary. Now, of course, the more obvious case is the Frankfurt School. In other words, that something like Platypus has been necessary. And the Frankfurt School both expresses that necessity and also expresses a failure to meet that necessity. In other words, there is a point to saying, theory divorced from practice can't actually even be theory, etc., etc. And we have, as an example of this, their discussion of refounding a communist party around the time of de-Stalinization, where they say this is something that we could do, or actually we couldn't do. It's something that must be done, but is impossible to be done, right? And we are really trying to do something quite different. So I want to remind us of some examples from the second phase in Platypus as misleading precedents. Partisan Review and the Frankfurt School. In other words, could Platypus be like the Partisan Review, which is what Ben Shepard, let's not forget the other Ben, Greg Gabrielis and Jeremy Cohen wanted. They wanted us to be a new Partisan Review. And Trotsky, of course, considered the Partisan Review dead from the start. In other words, that these are people who were writing as if they were headed for the concentration camp, which means that they're already in the concentration camp. Right, already dead. So we don't want to be Partisan Review. We don't want to be the Frankfurt School. In other words, we don't want to be people formulating theories and not sharing it with the world, and we don't want to be engaged and journalistic. We don't want to be Jacobin. Right? We don't want to be N+1. We don't want to be endnotes. We don't want to be these things. So in that respect, something like Platypus has always been necessary, and we trace it back to the early Marx, the ruthless criticism of everything existing. However, of course, how, right? How to engage in that ruthless criticism or ruthless critique, clarifying the confusion of the reformers, clarifying the confusion of those who would want to change the world. And in that respect, we remain one step removed, not only temporally or historically, but one step removed logically, one step removed practically from being a pre-political project in the sense of preparatory. Like, we're not formulating our strategy before implementing it or something like that. This also came up in the discussion at the plenary last night, because part of what Adolf Reed was saying about it being a premature moment is that he was saying we don't know how a political party will actually come into being. Right? The reason that we can't embark upon it is that it's not concretely presented to us as a task. And in that respect, of course, that's right, meaning that's part of the story. That's certainly a considerable issue. But that's been the case for quite some time, and nothing will happen in the world to change that. In other words, if it's already been the case for more than 40 years, we can't expect conditions to change such that a political formation will be appropriate in a way that it hadn't been previously. And that's why I had to say, in a rather one-sided way, well, Adolf, maybe what you tried to do at the Labour Party was the wrong thing to do. In other words, not premature, but rather the wrong step to take, the wrong party to form. That it shouldn't be a Labour Party, but it should be a socialist party, and that's why I roped in Mike McNair to help me out on that one, meaning that the socialists in the UK specifically failed by forming a Labour Party rather than a socialist party. So, again, pre-political, post-political. This is another formulation I want to offer from early on in Platypus, in our thinking and in our internal discussion at the time, that Platypus aims to turn a liability into an asset. Right? How do we turn a liability into an asset? How do we turn a break in continuity from a calamity into a virtue? Right? Can we make a virtue of necessity, which is always a very tricky thing. In other words, opportunism in thinking and in action is very much defined by trying to make a virtue out of necessity, and yet we have to do that. In other words, to say previous history of the left has demonstrated failure around making a virtue out of necessity. In other words, we could condemn Stalinism, for example, as making a virtue out of necessity, calling defeat victory. But that for us, paradoxically, it's actually the opposite case. In other words, where we might condemn the history of the left for making a virtue out of necessity, we have to embrace the fact that in our time, unlike in previous times, we actually have to make a virtue out of necessity. In other words, we can't avoid making a virtue out of necessity. We actually have to make a virtue out of necessity. We have to leverage a liability into an asset. And of course, that raises the classical philosophical problem of the Archimedean point. In other words, from what point do you leverage the earth, right? Is there just some special point where if you find it, you can actually leverage the whole world? Again, we have to make a virtue out of necessity in the sense that we have to try to do just that. In other words, we have to take the accumulated dead weight of the left and turn it into a force. rather than into a suppression of any possibility. Right? Rather than being crushed by the weight of the world, we have to have the weight of the world do something. Right? So, in that respect, we're trying to turn a post-political situation into a pre-political situation, which we can't do just by waving a magic wand. We can't say, oh, a post-political situation is a pre-political situation. Like, we can't just treat it just like that. Rather, we have no choice but to recognize that we are in a post-political condition, and we have to find whatever possibility might exist in that. Right, again, making a virtue out of necessity. We have to embrace the necessity of our moment as, in a sense, the necessity of impossibility. Meaning, everything that the left would offer as a potential what is to be done, we have to say, no, 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 no. Right? It's why I said at the plenary yesterday, look, all these guys have a bit of what needs to be done, but none of it is possible. Right? So they all have an aspect of the truth, but in fact none of it is possible. In other words, it's not possible to build labor unions, really. It's not possible to split and regroup and propagandize. It's not possible to have a left unity project in which we suddenly realize that we actually don't disagree on anything. That there is a common program that we can all get behind, and we can leave behind the ideological sectarianism and the propriety of little organizations. It's actually not possible to do any of those things, even though all of those things would have to be done. Right? So I want to say something else about the left unity, because it occurred to me before, when I was thinking about this presentation, but also came back home to me during the morning plenary. Namely, how is Platypus a left unity project? Because we are a left unity project. We want to know what the left has in common, not in terms of a collective asset, but rather a collective liability. In other words, when we say we're turning a liability into an asset, we want to know how the left, the entire left, from liberals to anarchists across the spectrum of Marxism, it all contributes to this liability. That's why we have to include everyone in the conversation. That's why we have to be ecumenical. That's why we have to be as inclusive as possible. Because they all have a key to the liability that has to be turned into an asset. So it's the unity of the graveyard, to use a Trotsky phrase from the inability of the Social Democrats and the Communists to unify to stop the Nazis. Well, they were unified anyway, but they were unified only in the graveyard of defeat. Right? Well, guess what? Of course, Trotsky was saying that in order to prevent that from happening, whereas we are saying not that we want that to happen, but that it has happened. In other words, the left is dead. And they have the unity of the graveyard already. They're all there. Again, another point with respect to the left being dead and the differential character of that. In other words, the institutionalized death of the left in the 80s and 90s, academicism, activism, etc., post-politicalism, post-leftism. But also, right, the 60s generation. In other words, we do take the New Left seriously in the sense that the 60s was some kind of a missed opportunity in the way that the 80s and 90s were not. The 60s and 70s were some kind of a missed opportunity with respect to this. And so the liability there is actually somewhat different, and indeed considerably different from the liability that we inherit from the 80s and 90s. In that respect, what we want to do is redeem their failed attempt. In other words, we have to sort of get in touch with what they were trying to do, because in some ways the New Left is different from the 20s and 30s, actually. In some ways, the 60s and 70s inherits the worst of the 20s and 30s, but in certain respects it actually has a promise that the 20s and 30s did not have, actually. And so that's why I always like to invoke Trotsky's whole generations thrown into discard from 1934 to build communist parties in an international anew. When he says, look, we're living in a time of whole generations thrown into discard, he did not change his mind in the Popular Front era about that. In other words, it's not that, oh, well, in the early 30s, there's this horrible moment in which the Nazis take power and it looks like the previous generation and even the current generation are completely useless. He didn't change his mind just because of the Spanish Civil War. No, that remained his viewpoint, in fact. In other words, Trotsky, unlike the Trotskyists who remember fondly the 30s, Trotsky thought that this was a desert period, the 30s. And so it was about picking up scraps. I remember Ben Blumberg doing some reading by James Cannon about the 30s, in which James Cannon was talking about, well, we have to make do with whatever human material. We have to make do with, indeed, the worst of the worst. Okay, so this transitions me into another point, which is, how do we deal with these 60s leftists, right? Mike McNair, Adolph Reed, Tom Riley. Implicitly, they all believe that they're the last of the Mohicans, they're the holdouts, they're like the hardcore, they're the real deal, and that's why they keep on keeping on, it's why they stuck with it. What we have to consider, however, is that maybe they were the worst of the 60s and 70s generation. In other words, maybe the people who remained leftists for the worst possible reasons. Not for the best reasons, but for the worst reasons. In other words, that in the 80s and 90s, the people who stayed on the left from the 60s and 70s stayed on the left because they were the worst, not because they were the best. And that includes Adolf. And Moish. Right? In other words, we have to make do with people who continue to call themselves leftists long after they stopped doing whatever it was that they were actually doing in the 60s and 70s. In which case, what's that? Right? Because the people who dropped off from the left, who became depoliticized, are not available. We don't know who they are. There are hundreds of thousands of people who just went back to civilian life. Right? They're not available to take their dying confessions, for us to take their dying confessions. So, again, that idea of, well, we have to turn a liability into an asset, it's a real liability, meaning it's a kind of twofold liability, namely that the New Left had its own problems and failed, and we have to make do with the remnants who might be the worst of that generation's attempt, rather than the best. Right? So, raise Juliet Mitchell, right, as a kind of an in-between case, where she's like, yeah, I'm not anymore, right? Good for her, right? Because of course, later kind of post-second wave, kind of latter end second wave feminists, Lynn Siegel has this nasty article about Juliet Mitchell then and now. Like, oh, whatever happened to you, Juliet Mitchell? And it's like, no, she was good, right? She disappeared, and that's actually to her credit. So you see where I'm going with this, about the liability and the asset. We have to recognize the deep liability, the real dead weight that we're trying to leverage. And in that respect, the pre-political, that formulation, obviously if we were to say, how is Platypus a post-political project, the problem with saying that is that then we're just joining the post-left. Right? So we're pre-political, but let's not be misled about that. It doesn't mean that we're immediately preparatory for something else. We're not. And I know that that's a rather provocative formulation, but it's meant to be. Right? It's meant to be. As a self-educational project, what we're educating ourselves in is the depth of the problem. The depth of the problem and the mass of the weight. Right? That's why it's via negativa. Because in fact, as bad as we think it might be, it's worse. because the human mind has a way of playing tricks on itself. Right? It's our biological instinct to survive that prevents us from facing just how horrible things really are. Okay, questions?
Got one there. Please clarify by what you mean by
By the worst.
By the worst. Is it because they fail to admit to themselves that they partake in pseudo-activity? Well, of course. In other words, what? The long march through the institution, becoming an academic. Right? That's a dodge right there. What I'm going to do is do history and show how black power led to black Democrats. Right?
Well, I mean, just to follow kind of up on that too, is that it's not just that, for instance, that's long march through the institutions and the academicization. It's not just that this was a missed opportunity. It obviously is that this is falling below, falling below kind of horizons of possibility that were being upheld earlier, and that's a missed opportunity. But it's albeit sometimes in obscure ways that aren't always clear, at least of all to, I think, that generation, actually they actively made things worse. I mean,
which they're willing to admit. They are willing to admit that, but that's our in. Our in is, we fucked up, the left is dead. That's our in. In other words, that's not our point of agreement.
Mm-hmm.
That's our in. So when Adolf Reed says there's no left, the left is dead, and it's been that way for a long time, we're not agreeing with him about that, because he means something entirely different than we do.
Oh, it happened.
She declared. Yeah. Hillary will be the next president of the United States. I'm pretty sure. And that's going to be a challenge for us, because we're going to have to go through what I was calling last night the neurasthenia of the Democrats. Namely, we're going to have to go through hothouse, intense, feverish activity, the Jacobin magazine, who knows, probably new projects, all about, staving off this inevitability, which is really complicity in it. Cam?
Yeah, I agree with what you have to say. I thought I thought you were going to talk about something else, though.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the one point to try to bring out is non-preparatory,
Mm-hmm.
pre-political is not being so much as before,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
The emphasis not being temporal,
Mm-hmm.
but being in the absence of something else.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But so originally, when we would talk about a pre-political project being Platypus, the preparation was not so much sort of for us, but it was a kind of
The environment.
the possibility existing somehow in the future, right? That we would create material that then might lead others who are educated through our work into becoming political in a different way in which they can become political today.
Absolutely.
So it is preparatory in that way.
In that way.
Right? In which, Spencer, said, you might not be my comrade in that project, right? We might find ourselves in, different sides of, line.
Mhm.
Now you're saying, well, we might not partake in that at all.
Well, I'm
might
not saying we, there's we and there's we, meaning that
Members
the project.
of the organization, individuals is what I mean, right?
Okay.
We are
Mhm. Which I'm not referring to that exactly. Because it's not about that, it's about our common project. In other words, it's about us as members of Platypus, which doesn't preclude other things, however, it should give pause about other things, right? And so, what we're talking about here, again, to measure the depth of the problem, the kind of via negativa, what I wanted to say about that is, of course, how is it important for us to declare that the left was dead when it seemed to be coming back to life? Well, we understood two things. One, the essence of what the left was doing, and secondly, what we could do about that, which flows from each other. Meaning that we did not think that what was bad about the left was that they might stop the Iraq War. Of course not. If they had stopped the Iraq, that would have been something entirely different, right? And would have, in fact, challenged our project in a good way. But they were never going to do that. That's the point. They were never going to do that.
Okay, because
right? And so what do? They provide a bad education, right?
Yeah.
And so we could do something about that. in the sense that we could dissolve ideological obstacles. Like that was another formulation that we had, that Platypus's activity is to dissolve ideological obstacles to the possibility of a future left.
Well, that's what Ian meant by draining the swamp.
He also meant literally keeping people from being recruited to the ISO and being burned out that way. In other words, keeping people in a kind of more liminal, or only quasi-political place where they could absorb these ideas without feeling like, and now I have to put them into practice, or the ideas are invalidated. So he wanted to drain the swamp in the sense of an actual ecosystem in which people who are curious about Marxism express that curiosity about Marxism by joining an organization that will burn them out forever for Marxism.
And all that they would actually give them is bad education. But I didn't actually get to say what I wanted to
Okay,
say.
go ahead.
All right,
Mhm.
so I just wanted to formulate the thought. So the pre-political. Like, it seems to me that the emphasis in our original Constitution was about creating this educational material that then would provide the grounds on which, or the conditions on which, people could become political in a better way than they can today. Okay, so we're in agreement. But the educational or pedagogical kind of dimension of our project depends on our ability to formulate our panels and push the left, right? Now, if the left is, in contrast to the Iraq War, which it seemed active, actually non-existent,
Flatlining.
right? Like in the Bay Area, there's no Marxists to invite to our panels, and that there's this sort of hole, then it does put pressure on us. I think that's...
So we become the Marxists.
Yeah, and that's the difficulty, because, we emphasize our negative activity, the via negativa, and yet the via negativa depends on the object of the left that we are pushing.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, this seems to be the difficulty.
It
How
is.
to be pre-political in this context.
How to be pre-political in another sense, in a post-political environment in another sense. Meaning, when we started out, we were pre-political in a post-political environment in a way that's actually quite different from now.
Yes.
Both the post-political character and the pre-political character. In other words, what we were dealing with was not a new left that was politicized by the Iraq War in order to open up, like the new SDS, right? So the MDS, what they said, the 60s generation, old SDSers, said to the new SDSers, don't be a single-issue movement. It can't just be about the war, right? And so they wanted it to be pre-political in a different sense, whereas we were saying, this is all about it being over, meaning this is the last hurrah of the Vietnam anti-war movement, is what it is. It's not something new. It's something very old.
Right, but now?
Right, and now, we can't say Black Lives Matter is not something new, but it's just the Black Power movement. We can't say what Adolf says, right, about it, right? That it's just some degenerate version of the same. Because that's
we're really closer to what Nim said, which
right.
is just distant from the left.
Exactly.
Trying to pretend it's something other than...
That's right. And, Tana.
Well, this is kind of going back to what you were talking about the worst, and I feel like this is something that we deal with both a lot in panels, but also when I'm talking to contacts, because for a lot of people, it becomes apparent that sectarians, they can easily see, even though I don't actually
They
share
misread what's
yeah,
worst.
they see the sectarians as just being nutcases, but then they see people like Walter Ben Michaels and Adolf Reed as speaking the obvious truth, and so they're attracted to that. And then I'm just wondering how is it possible, or if we could discuss a little bit about how to bring this out to people who are contacts, people who we're bringing to our events, how to kind of discuss this issue of not to be
Richard had
fooled.
a good formulation on the OrgCom recently about one comparison that we like to make about the post-New Left sectarian Marxist scene is the RCP is not as stupid as they appear to be. That's the problem. The problem is that they're not as stupid as they might even want to be themselves, actually. They might wish themselves to be stupider than they actually are. The problem with the ISO is that not only do they appear more intelligent than they actually are, but they think they're more intelligent than they actually are, which is what makes the IA so much worse than the RCP. The RCP's intelligence is purely like autopilot, meaning it's just, you know, the degree to which they channel certain things. But the reason that I raise that is that academicism and activism, right? The danger in the second phase and the danger in the fourth phase, because there's a way in which I want to retract the half, right? Not 4th and a half or 4th and 3/4, or 4th phase, right? Is that the academics are going to be more attractive than the sectarians. And that's where we have to push in the other direction and say, look, the sectarian left is much more intelligent than the academic left, in fact. Because what you find is that Adolf has, for example, a much more wooden notion of going to the working class than the organized sectarian Marxist left has. You would think that they would have a worse, more reified view of that. And in fact, Adolf last night expressed a much more reified view of that. Like much less realistic than Tom Riley. Right? Like Tom Riley was much more realistic about going to the working class than Adolf was. And that was striking.
Also came up in the electoral politics on the left thing. Tom Riley was discussing what election cycles can do for the left, and the other panelists were much more abstract. And he was like, look, like if you have 1,000 members in Chicago, maybe you go and like knock on doors, you put in a ton of work, and you get like 30 new contacts, and like 10 of them join.
That's the problem with the IBT, by the way, is that what they've done is turned it into a long haul that never ends. Meaning, like, they've naturalized it in another way.
But that's also much more reflective of the reality of the situation, where it's like these aren't going to really be opportunities in the way that, looking into the past, elections might have been opportunities for the left. So there is a registration of that, even if they have ways of rationalizing it.
Let me jump to an abstract generalization of this, because it was something that I mentioned to some people after the panel last night about Adolf. Namely that his sobriety, which is his virtue, is also his liability. In other words, the fact that he's realistic gives him his critical insight, but it also kills him politically, right? And so what that means is that we have to be very suspicious of the realism and the sobriety, because what the realism and the sobriety is actually a deep illusion. A delusion is what it is. And in that respect, we're not interested in the left where they're realistic. We're interested in the left where they're utopian, right? And that's why we emphasize the ideological and rather than the practical. Go ahead.
This also came out when, like, Reed's insistence that his definition of the left is dead was really about social forces.
Practical.
He kept on insisting that it was about, like, not having people on the ground.
Not organized.
Which is also why this is his conception of why, like, the 40s are like a high point.
A high point,
right?
because they were
Whereas
really organized.
ideologically, they are like at the
low
lowest,
point.
Yeah.
Right. That his holding up the Stalinism of the 40s as a high point, there was all this practical strength, but it was total liquidation of socialism as an idea. Total liquidation of socialism as an idea.
So on the opposite, it appeared yesterday that there is this account of Trotskyist groups, and I think what Trotsky says in Bolshevism and Stalinism, that it's now the time to uphold the banner and keep it clean. So what does that mean?
Well, we can't follow Trotsky either. Look, when we say Trotsky in the Frankfurt School, what we say is, they failed. In other words, what they tried to do, both the Trotsky and the Frankfurt School tried to do, was hang on to something from 1917. But in fact, they couldn't. And what's good about both Trotsky and the Frankfurt School is that unlike their followers, they were actually aware of that. In other words, they were aware of what was being lost. And so, I'm not going to, sort of dispute Trotsky's optimism, but I am going to say we can't embody it. Richard?
Yeah, I'm going to make some comments. I find myself sort of frustrated by this conversation, and I think it's the terms in which it's posed, like about the pre-political and the post-political, about the pre-political and the post-political. So, several things. I had two moments of epiphany this weekend. One was that we spent a lot of time around Tom Riley, And I found myself in this weird role around Tom Riley, when Tom Riley would say something, and people, Platypus people would be around, and they wouldn't understand the point he was making, and I would think, well, I can translate that, right? And I would be the translator, and I would say, well, this is what he really means, and
By the way, that's what really got us out of the Spartacus League, is that we tried to translate what they were saying, and they were like, that's not what we're saying.
well, but the thing
Right?
was,
No, really. But in fact, we were actually translating what they were saying. In other words, we were actually grasping the rational kernel of it, but they did, couldn't handle it, and so they were
but
deeply
the
suspicious.
thing was that actually Tom Riley did accept that I was
good.
translating. So that, and like at first I found this like an amusing situation, and later on in the wee hours of the morning, like, walking home drunk and feeling like really depressed and unnerved by that, and what it meant in terms of like a world historical context. And the other moment of epiphany that I had to do with Mike McNair. And I've been much more dismissive of the CPGB than Chris. And I don't really take their historical narrative. And I was hearing like the sort of the anti-Hegelianism.
Yeah.
And I thought like, oh, I kind of in some way, like it's hard for me to put into words, but I think I kind of get why it is that Chris is so engaged with the CPGB. And why, like, the two conversations that really seemed to me to be happening on the panel were one conversation basically between Chris and Mike McNair, right? Not really between Chris and another, an obvious argument between Adolf and Tom Riley, right? One about Trotskyism versus Stalin, and one Hegelianism versus Althusserianism, whatever. And I suppose, and I just, one thing, like I never liked the metaphor of draining the swamp. So it's like a metaphor that I'm opposed to. The other thing is like the Vietnam.
So you definitely wouldn't like bleaching the butcher's block.
But the other thing about the via negative, and this is a little bit of frustration here, is there is like an inherent via negative in Platypus. But I think like there's also a question, like, and here the discussion has been mostly on Platypus talking to people outside of Platypus, right? I think the real challenge in the fourth and a half phrase is not Platypus going outside. It's the effect of the fourth and a half or fourth phase on us.
On the organization.
And that has to do with the question of how we understand Platypus as a project. So really, I think the question of the pre-political is not about how the left thinks about itself, but
it's how we think about our own project.
How we would think about potentially being political. Not necessarily us, Platypus, as an organization, right? But what it would mean
to be political at all.
To be political at some future point, right? And that's where I think, and I will like take apart like what I think is a certain translation. So Platypus has a narrative, a historical narrative that's basically closer to Tom Riley's than anybody else on the panel. But there is, in terms of looking towards the future, I think, a fundamental affinity of Platypus towards a kind of neo-Kautskyism, right? And we have to think about the tension between those two visions, because they're, in a sense, in contradiction.
Well, I mean, this is where actually...
And the third element, which
is
the most esoteric, and which is like the least explained, and we've talked about this on the OrgCon, is there's a funny kind of parallelism, and Chris gets this, and it's like a very weird esoteric point, between us and a kind of Bordigaism, like a
Amadeo Bordiga,
Amadeo Bordiga. And it was interesting, like the guy from the Tampa Communist was like, yeah, we're sort of like a synthesis between
Kautsky and Bordiga.
Kautsky and Bordiga. And the fact that like we live in a moment in which those possibilities would even seem possible, or that we live in a moment where Jacobin tries to split the difference between the ISO and DSA. And that at the same time, we as an organization represent a kind of ghost of a memory of Trotskyism and the Frankfurt School. So we have to think about like how these strands tie together in terms of the project of our own political consciousness. So in the previous discussion, I was just say one thing. So I felt like the discussion was about fora. And so when you're talking about fora, you're talking about explaining the project and putting on fora and reaching outside.
But also attending left events as
And attending
symptomatic.
left events. And so the
Asymptomatic.
biggest problem with the fora, of course, is the question about like boycotts, hostility, etc. But if you think about like the PR, right, the biggest issue for the PR is not like anti-Marxism. It's rather, in some ways, like the question of how we distinguish ourselves as a project from Jacobin, right? Like, why read the PR and not Jacobin, right? And what does it mean that we are Marxist and they are sort of Marxist, and how we are Marxist in a different sense? I mean, because Jacobin does have a kind of historical consciousness.
They do. They soft-pedal it. Ken?
Just to kind of reply to Richard a little bit about the discussions with Tom Riley. I mean, I think what you were doing in that conversation when you were being Tom's attorney was very generous, because like you were contextualizing his position taking and you were relating it to the history of Trotskyism. And like it's a history that I'm somewhat familiar with. So I think what the whole point of like what makes a figure like Tom kind of ludicrous is that like there's this discontinuity there, like a break that's happened that he doesn't realize.
Yeah.
So that these, they have this organizational form that comes from this legacy of, splits and regroupments. What they actually do when they recruit is one by one. They've never split anything.
Right.
So, can I?
It's just, so it's so kind of like it's a nice thing to do.
I mean, what you were saying, Richard, I want to just respond to the Mike McNair versus Tom Riley view of the left, view of what to do about the left, and how they were the more serious perspective, actually, than Adolf's perspective on the panel. So, again, it's not going to happen through splits and regroupments, right? And the only reason why it can't happen at the level of a left unity initiative is that, program, right? So the idea that Mike McNair has, or neo-Kautskians have, is that if we can unite around a program, but you still have to have a sense of what the program is really for, right? And so that's why that's why we're one step removed, right? Because we're not formulating, it's not like we're investigating the world in order to formulate a strategy that can be put into a program. We're actually considering, what does socialism mean? What does it mean, really? And that's where, Mike McNair and Tom Riley would both agree. They would be like, oh, well, it's self-evident what socialism means. And
too bad nobody knows about it.
yeah, it's like, or they've always known, going back to Jesus Christ. Like, like not only is it self-evident, but everybody has always known what it means, right? Because in the depths of medieval, civilization, people still dreamed about paradise, and so they knew what socialism was. And it's like, no, I mean, in fact, and that's where I got, Adolf to be a little bit of his academic side when I said, in order to know what socialism is, you really need to know what capitalism is. In other words, the via negativa argument, and Adolf was like, yeah, that's true. In a way that, again, Tom Riley and Mike McNair treated self-evident. We know what capitalism is, we know what socialism is. And that's the other way in which it's post-political, pre-political. We have to turn a liability into an asset in the sense of, because there's no immediate struggle for socialism, we can actually contemplate what's meant by socialism. Just to bring up Adolf yet again, that I think it's in the Paths to Critical Theory, one of the supplemental readings we do in the reading group, where he said, well, things were happening so fast in the 60s and 70s that we didn't have time to stop and reflect on what we were doing. Which is a paradox, right? Because it's kind of like, well, by the time you get the chance to stop and reflect on what you're not doing it anymore, and so you're not actually reflecting on it anymore. Right? And it's also kind of bullshit, meaning there's much more to reflect upon, and in fact, it's the only occasion to reflect upon it when you're doing it, in the heat of it. So the idea that, well, in the 80s we were able to really think and figure out what we had done, that's one of the ways in which I mean the worst. Right? Because the saner people didn't reflect upon it because it was over. Right? Whereas to say, oh, well, now we have a chance to figure out what we were doing, that's the delusion. actually. Ed, and then Spencer.
I have a kind of clarificatory question. You mentioned how Adolf Reed sees Black Lives Matter as a kind of, I guess, bastardized version or degenerated version of the 1960s New Left.
Black Power turn.
And you mentioned that you don't see it that way, or the Platypus doesn't see it that way. And I guess...
Well, because what that would mean is that a potential is being squandered. Right? Like, in other words, the Black Power turn is a crime, actually. It's a crime. Right? It's not just a confession of bankruptcy, it's also a crime. In a way that we can't say Black Lives Matter is a crime, because what should they be doing otherwise? You know, the civil rights movement actually generated a possibility that was actively liquidated in the Black Power turn. But you were saying?
Oh, well, yeah, I guess I just found it kind of curious then, because actually I think our narrative about the left is that, like Adolf had an interesting sort of similarity but disagreement in the sense that he said there is no left agency, whereas I think a lot of what we were trying to push is that actually the left has been agentic, but in ways that have constituted the status quo. I think this is a key thrust of Platypus pedagogy about the entire history of the left. So I found it kind of the disagreement interesting.
It actually brings up, this is a point, Jamie in the Black Politics panel raised the question of reification, and I found myself thinking about it and thinking, well, you know, so what's the only category for which a reified approach is appropriate? It would be capitalism. In other words, is there something that one can critically, rather than apologetically or affirmatively, attribute agency to something that isn't really a thing? Well, of course, capitalism itself, right? In which case, you know, that's you know, the issue. The issue is if the left has always been an engine of capitalism, right? Again, the problem with the left is it's anti-capitalism, meaning that it is an engine of capitalism but denies it, rather than embracing and recognizing that, right? Which is what distinguishes it, right? Spencer and then Gabe.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about, you know, the previous convention talking about the role of the three of us and the consciousness of the post-political 80s and 90s moment, which I think you guys were oriented to by your experience of the Spartacists, both what was the 80s, what just passed, and you know what's to come, and of course I think your response to what was to come was to drop out of politics.
Absolutely.
Whereas I was, you know, in a sense, trying to come to Marxism and finding it completely impossible. And in that way...
In the 90s.
In the 90s. But the recognition, the consciousness of that impossibility is what really prepared me to be participating in Platypus. And so when the anti-war movement came, we immediately saw the ghostly character of this, because we knew that all of the impasse that we recognized had not been addressed.
Has not gone away.
And in that sense, you know, I've always, you know, I think I said in the Orgcom report last year, Platypus was made for the fourth phase, right? Platypus was made to recognize the depth of the problem, and what I would emphasize is that where we fail is really, and I think this is what Richard was saying, you know, it's not really about the external environment. It's really about the threat of pseudo-activity. You know, it's really about doing Platypus without consciousness. right? It's about, failing, and I think that happened at some of the panels, right? That we weren't entirely happy with some of the panels at the convention, not because of the panelists, not because the work hadn't in some sense been done in some sort of, grunt work, technical, organized, send the emails, get the people present.
Because we weren't sure about why we were doing them.
We weren't sure why we were doing them, and therefore we weren't really actualizing Platypus. We weren't really asking questions as members of Platypus. We were asking questions as individuals, and so forth.
No, I noticed that. Yeah.
And I don't, exempt myself, or failing to ask questions. And so, what I would say is that when we do Platypus, when it's actualized, or when we really solicit an article and take someone through the process of the editorial process of the PR, rather than just get a submission and slap it in, so the next issue is there, we never have a problem with the left, right? They always say, this was really good.
They sense the difference?
Except the sectarians don't let their stuff be
I actually
touched.
thought that the lesson from a lot of the our semi-internal panel was that our practice makes, if we do it well, sometimes we'll have the result of making the left hostile to us, because
But it makes the left hostile to us because they know what just happened.
Right. No, but what I'm saying is that, right, but in that sense, again, it's not like people walk away feeling like, well, that was a really productive, they might sort of walk away feeling like it was well, fuck you guys. Now that might mean our success still, but you know what I mean?
Who did you have in mind, Pam?
Yeah.
Oh, what happened with Walter Ben Michaels when he was like, that was 2 hours worth of crap, and see ya.
I wanted to talk about that.
Yesterday or
Yeah.
Friday?
Yeah, last night.
Oh.
Yeah, so first I wanted to respond to the...
That's okay though.
I want to talk about the IBT and Walter Ben Michaels.
Okay.
So just one is to follow up on what Cam and Richard were saying about the IBT, how Tom Riley, Richard felt. So I was one of the people in this conversation late into the night talking to Tom Riley, and one of the things that was strange was what Cam was saying, was that the context of their arguments, they don't seem to register the failure of the Soviet Union, or and the context has changed. So that's one thing.
Can't have revolutionary defeatism in imperialism if there's no revolutionary force.
You can't defend a deformed worker state when there's no longer a deformed worker state.
Right.
So that's one. But then the other thing is that they have a certain kind of attitude that makes it so that they're actually emphasizing the wrong points in the argument. So it's Tom Riley was talking about how it's important for the Iraqi people to determine their own destiny. In the context of talking about defeat.
It's up to them to get rid of Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
Not the
Which
United
is
States.
a weirder way of putting it, and that came up again and again and again.
It's not just that it's weird; it's just they don't actually believe that. And
Yeah.
when you say that, he clarifies, "Yes, we don't believe that," but he doesn't say it.
Right.
Right. So, just to clarify, in terms of Kim, not only did I have the feeling I was translating, but it reminded me of the story my father told me about being in Guatemala, and there were these Japanese businessmen, and they were speaking Spanish with a very heavy Japanese accent, and the Guatemalans didn't understand what they were saying and thought they were speaking Japanese. So my father started to translate, analogizing to Japanese accent in English, he started to translate heavily Japanese accented Spanish into normal Spanish. And they were very impressed that not only did he know English and Spanish, he also knew Japanese. So the reason that Tom Riley, one of the reasons that he wasn't clear was, and again, I felt this talking to him, I saw how deeply affected he was by New Leftists. Now he's someone who consciously broke with the New Left, right? It's not about so much a specific political position. It's the way that a particular generational experience sort of
Doesn't translate
and also deformed his narrative of things. So he, it was always like he kept, like there was this kind of tone of like the basic like gut instinct for a leftist is this indignation with imperialism, right? It had this like very, it had this like kind of weatherman quality, even though he wasn't saying that, right? He was actually saying things that were actually quite different and more sophisticated, but he didn't realize like his own, the way his own political
His concession.
Right, he didn't, and he didn't realize like how he sounded, right? And so what I found oppressive when I thought about the experience later was the way like a kind of platypus perspective requires you to take on a burden of interpreting what feels impossible for people themselves to be clear about. And and you, Cam, said I was being generous, right? And that was exactly my intent. Because I know enough about the logic of these positions, that they're actually more like the RCP, although more intelligent than they sound, the way Tom Riley was presenting them. And that Tom Riley would acknowledge that. But I also felt this incredible, I also felt really angry at some level with Tom Riley. Because there's a way in which...
Because you're frustrated.
There's frustrated, but there's also like a historical betrayal in terms of the problem of like historical memory.
Well, we should feel that way. In other words, I definitely was angry at Adolf last night. And, what I'd say about generosity is I think that...
Before going to Adolf, can we clarify this difference between Walter Ben Michaels and...
Oh, all right. So I'll let you say something about Walter Ben Michaels after I say something about generosity.
Okay.
Generosity, no, because this is part of the boycott letter, killing with kindness. Yeah. Killing with kindness, right? That Chris Cutrone says, killing with kindness. And I'm like, well, I could kill you with meanness. Wouldn't you rather, get the euthanasia needle, and be embraced while it's happening? Oh, poor baby. Sorry. Or do you want to slap in the face before you get the euthanasia needle? Right? So, generosity is actually crucial to what Platypus is doing.
That's what slice of the guillotine.
Right, merciful. But the point of the matter is that to take a good dying confession, one has to be actually quite generous. And in fact, that is the spirit with which we have to approach our events. We have to approach them, and when we fail to be generous, or when we react against our own generosity, that's a kind of a defense mechanism that we have to be aware of. In other words, that's a kind of a block. Meaning, I kind of felt like, again, feeling angry at Adolf, I kind of felt like, well, that's a failure on my part, actually. But, yeah, Walter Ben Michaels.
Just before I get to Walter Ben Michaels, just one more thing on the IBT, which is just that I think that there's something to be learned from that posture that they were taking, that Tom Riley was taking, and it kind of relates to something that Richard had said on a panel a long time ago, a convention plenary, about like why do you think that they continue to maintain this kind of line? And you said it was sort of like this need to maintain like a kind of attitude. Anyway,
by the way, that's true of the left in general. In other words, that's also true of the ISO. So you should have, the point of the matter is, this should not have been something that you realized in the middle of the night in 2015. It's something you should have realized in 2008 when Platypus was first starting and when we were talking to the ISO. You should have realized that that is it, the attitude.
Well, they got what they wanted, the Iraqi resistance won.
Okay, so then the other thing is like
throwing off buildings.
Okay, so then the other thing about Walter Ben Michaels and Adolf Reed last night. So they were both really upset with the panel afterwards, in a way. Although they remained diplomatic to us, and so one of the things that Walter Ben Michaels was saying after the panel is like, this was 2 hours of a waste of time, because basically because talking with sectarians is a waste of time.
Sure.
And Walter Ben Michaels said, if there weren't so many forces aligned against the left, killing the sectarians would allow for a new left, basically.
Well, that's just the Stalinism, yeah.
Yeah, and so...
I mean, they did that at one time, And they would do that again, by the way. They would do that again.
But they were there not for the panel, but to try to recruit the people in the audience. And that's that's the success of the project.
Wait,
actually.
That
shows the success of the project, that we attracted Walter Ben Michaels and Adolf Reed. because they wanted to talk to the audience.
Oh, all right. Yeah, of course.
So that's like-
Absolutely, of course.
Still, that means I'm fucked in the department.
Oh, Gregor, this is the danger of being in graduate school, right? Is that you're locked in
You're
a
not fucked. That is just a
you're locked in a torture chamber with these academics.
It's Jeremy Collins.
You know,
No.
we should wrap up. Because we've gone over time already. Yeah.
Very quick. Super quick.
Okay.
Just about, also about people being angry, like that it's, wait a little while before you come down, because like also a lot of times, I know there's been many instances where people were upset about panels with the panelists and or we ourselves were, but then later in transcribing it, we actually found that there was some value in it, or people like later like came around. So that may or may not happen now. But
Our
like,
own anger.
Yeah. But so like, we need to get a little bit of distance before we kind of make a final verdict, one way or the other.
Could I say one thing about translation? It would be great if you could do some more translation, because actually oftentimes I find myself, like, there are just sometimes when sectarians are talking, and I cannot figure out what their point is, because it's like, they're like in a time machine, and I don't know what's going on. So if you could, like, if what you did at the party, because I was in that conversation for a second, and then I was like, I gotta get out of here, I don't know, like, what's going on.
Wow.
That would be very helpful.
I second that. I mean, that was very useful, what you were doing for me, but you were like translating kind of in live time, real time, and it, like sort of midst of the conversation. And what you had brought up for me was very interesting, and this is sort of like the, I guess the generational slippage that's happening. In other words, what you had pointed out was that it was the sort of practice of him being axiomatic as a sort of proof of his own integrity and the integrity of his position. That was more important than what he was actually saying.
Mm-hmm.
I would have never come to that conclusion myself. I would have just dismissed it. But I understand, and for him to have that perspective, and especially how it would have been important in the period that he was sort of being
formed,
sort of training himself in the formative period when he was developing this sensibility, or when it was happening, when it was necessary.
In the 70s, yep.
What I mentioned earlier this week is one of the most difficult things for me to learn in Platypus was the value of talking to leftists. Like, it was actually the least appealing. I just wanted to hear the intellectuals in Platypus tell me, give me the answer. And a lot of times our panels can be frustrating precisely because we're looking for someone to be in agreement with, whether it's Adolf Reed or the IVT, or Chris, who's really just trying to problematize all of it.
Right.
When he's up there. And that sort of like, and it took a lot of training in Platypus. It took like fucking Spencer kicking me in the ass to say go talk to the RCP. And I'm like, I don't want to. But no, showing me that there's something to learn from actually getting on their level, on their wavelength, and sticking with it so you understand what's going on.
The rationale.
Let me just to pick up on it. The danger in this conversation is the idea that Richard can say it better than Tom Riley, because he can't.
But we can't understand sometimes.
At all. But the point is also not to hear Tom Riley clearly. The point is to hear Tom Riley's discussion with Adolf and with Mike McNair. Right? The point is to see the way that Tom Riley's position at its clearest, even driven to a level of clarity, is actually incoherent in 2015.
In itself. Yeah, in itself. So that's why it can't be this dialogical thing. But, it only made sense as a follow-up. In other words.
Well, I just say, I completely agree with that sentiment. So my active translation is
unfortunate.
People, well, I mean, not unfortunate. It's just if you can read the Iliad in Greek, you should read the Iliad in Greek. It's just most people who are going to read it or want to read it don't know Greek, so someone
I think
should
we're just talking about different conversations, right? This is like a
right.
post-event.
That's a post-event, but it's also like I realize that.
And the greatest classicists can't write Homer in Greek. You couldn't write a third epic.
Right, and it's
okay, but I'm saying but the question of authenticity. Of like a voice.
You're not translating the accent. That's the point. There's something instructive about the
but
accent.
Spencer actually is raising an important point, which I would like it's about the need to actually hear people, right? In other words, it isn't like, so it is about like understanding the terminology.
Processing it.
Processing it, right? So that's like the, if you want like a kind of commentary or like footnote, but it's also about like hearing
The actual
original,
thing. Yeah.
right? It actually is about encountering like the people in whom it is incarnated.
And encountering the history.
And encountering the history. It's not like one of the aspects about fora is not just like a set of ideas.
Right. We're talking about, we gotta move on because
Okay.
Ken was talking about like digesting the
Digesting.
panel
Yeah.
versus what you would do
Which-
at a panel. I think it would be
Sorry, I
incredibly
thought that was not-
No, that's
unproductive
okay. Yeah, yeah.
if like Richard was sitting next to a Platypus member during a panel of students. That would like not be a
Not-
Platypus.
Right, I understand.
Yeah.
Which,
Okay.
I mean,
Let's move on.
yeah.
We got, it's 3 o'clock.
All right.
Keep going. Good job.
You want to just keep it running? Or we can
No,
have it?
we'll different recordings. Well, different recordings.
Wait,